what we intended, and some people who maybe are joining us for the first time. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Head, Heart, Brain, but just suffice to say we are a consultancy. We work in the area of leadership development and HR policy and practice, backed by neuroscience. So we look at what the science is saying and base our advice or our leadership programs on that. And this self-assessment that we've developed really came out of our work with leaders, and leaders particularly interested in understanding how much the way they were leading, both themselves and others, was brain savvy. So we've put this self-assessment together, and what we've been doing over the last month is really asking people to complete it so we can collect some norm data. And it's been incredibly successful. We've had many, many more people than we expected completing that. But before we get started and talk about the content of that assessment, can I just start by asking you this quick poll? So how many of your organizations are satisfied with the quality of leaders and the way they lead? So if you would place your votes now, that would be really helpful. Interesting. So as you were voting, by far the biggest number is that you've got some good people but not enough, followed by not really satisfied at all. And I guess this is one of the reasons that we were motivated to try and help organizations understand that if leaders lead in a way that's consistent with how the brain works, they tend to get better results. And certainly that's what we've found. What we wanted to do was see whether we can help people identify what that is. And we put together a number of elements, and those of you who've done the self-assessment will have recognized some of these. So we wanted to look at social connection, and that's about how others connect, how people connect with each other, but also how much they understand themselves, how they understand their own motivations and so on. Social control, how much they manage their emotions and the things that trigger emotions. We've looked at how people lead change using our core model. We haven't necessarily mentioned core, but that's what the questions stem from. We've looked at Carol Dweck's, the basis of Carol Dweck's work on mindset. So we have a number of questions around that to help you understand what's your belief system about how you learn and how you're successful. And finally, we've looked at work habits. So how many of you have taken the questionnaire? Liz, can I drag this over?
Done.
Yeah. Okay. So most people, but not all of you. The questionnaire will stay available to you until the end of next week. So if you want to know what your results are, please do it by then. And when you do the questionnaire, what you'll get is a kind of summary report of how you've answered and what it means. So I'd encourage you. And if people have got any comments on the questionnaire, please feel free to type them in the chat box. Or if you've got a lot of comments, and a few people have had a lot of comments, please feel free to drop me an email. Because as I say, we're still refining it, so we're very interested to hear your views. So let's look at what the questionnaire was really covering about leaders. And so the first one, as I said, is social connection, understanding yourself and others. And this really stems mainly from the work of Matthew Lieberman, and you'll see we'll send you a link to his excellent TED Talk. So Lieberman's hypothesis is that we developed a big prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain that's often called the executive brain. And most people, or most theories of brain development, assume that we developed that in order to manage our analytical thinking and our planning and goal setting. And I guess that was the prevailing theory, and it's particularly, I think, the prevailing theory in business that, you know, the smarter people are, i.e. the more they use that cortical part of the brain, the more effective they are as leaders. But Lieberman's hypothesis, and I think what other neuroscience research is showing, is that our need for social connection was both from an evolutionary point of view an advantage, but also in business is an advantage. So people who can understand others and understand themselves seem to do better in business. And there's some quite interesting research that Lieberman had done with the management research group, where they looked at the 360s of thousands of leaders and found that those who were both good at task and at understanding others, so connecting, having good relationships with others, were more likely to be rated as successful leaders. The bad news is that less than 1% of leaders were good at both those things, so good at both task and understanding others. And there's some brain-based reasons for why this may be so important. So one is that social connection seems to be a primary need. As humans, we can't be successful without connecting with others. If you think about the way we work in business, we work in teams. We have to get things done through others, and we have to understand what it is that others are trying to do and what their motivation is. And the better we are at reading others, the more successful we probably are. The other brain-based information that I think is really interesting is that the parts of the brain that we use for understanding others, what's often called the default system, overlaps about 85% with the parts of the brain that we use for understanding ourselves. So, you know, one of the things that neuroscientists are beginning to look at is, if we understand ourselves better, are we also better able to understand the motivations of others, and hence use that understanding to better lead and manage them. So that's the first part. Feel free to type some questions in if you have questions about that. I think the implication here for business is that, you know, do your leadership programs actually, first of all, really focus on helping people understand themselves and translating that understanding into what it might mean, the impact they may be having on other people. The next area we looked at is social control. Now, I think, particularly if you're British, but certainly in companies I've worked with around the world, being able to control your emotions is seen as a good thing in business. So whether you're British or not, the stiff upper lip is the prevailing kind of assumption about what makes for a good leader, someone who probably doesn't show their emotions or is in control of them. So if they show them, they're only showing the positive ones. And there's been a lot of work around emotional control and what the impact is. So what's happening at a brain level is when we lose control, when we have an emotional episode, so we get upset or we get angry, often what's happening is the amygdala is taking over the prefrontal cortex. So Daniel Goleman called this an amygdala hijack. And when that happens to you, it's that time when you you feel that you, you know you can no longer think straight, and in really extreme situations you probably can't even remember what it was you were trying to say or were meant to be doing. And one of the ways we use to manage emotions is often suppression, and what a neuroscientist called Kevin Oshner has found is that suppression is incredibly ineffective way of managing emotions. First of all, the external impact of the emotion, so our facial expressions and the level of tension in our body will still be read by others. So people at some level, even at an unconscious level, will know that you're experiencing that emotion. The second thing is that what Oshner has found is that actually suppressing those emotions increases the activity in the amygdala. And so you're actually increasing the intensity of the emotion. And that also has with it a number of physiological impacts. So increased blood pressure, stress, cortisol in the system, all of the things that kind of are not very helpful. He's also shown that using suppression makes us more susceptible to having emotional control issues later. So really not a helpful methodology for your leaders. The other thing that I think is important that neuroscience has shown us is that having emotional control, having good emotional regulation, is actually linked to greater productivity in people in work contexts. So some work by Evie and Gordon there that shows that those with the greatest emotional control also tend to be more productive. And some of that is probably around not getting distracted, being able to actually maintain your goals and stay focused. Hold on a minute, I'm a bit croaky. And I guess the greatest research that's been done around this is Walter Michel's what's become known as the marshmallow test, where he got young children to have to wait to eat a marshmallow. So they were told they could have one marshmallow now, but if they waited 10 or 15 minutes while the scientist who was running the experiment went out of the room, they could have 2 marshmallows. And what those children who were most able to wait the 10 to 15 minutes also went on in their 20s to be more successful both in business and social context. So I can see we've got Peter here who's asking me a question. Let me just pause and look at what you're saying, Peter. I find doing the Hogan Development Survey with senior leaders is a powerful tool to help them understand the impact of little emotional control. Yeah, I know that, and I think we've actually got Jeremy who distributes and manages that survey in the UK on the line today. So yeah, helping people to, I think there are 2 sides to this. So one, helping people to understand how important emotional control is one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is teaching them techniques for controlling emotions, because this is happening mainly at a unconscious or kind of automatic level. Unless we've got some techniques for managing those, especially under stress, as you say, Peter, then we're likely to be taken over without being able to do very much about it. And a psychologist called James Gross has done a lot of work and has a model of emotional control, and we've put up an article that summarizes his his model for you at the end of this webinar. I don't really have time to go through it all at the moment. But one of the biggest findings is that practicing mindfulness meditation really helps people to deal with this area and to take a kind of distance between themselves and their emotions, and to kind of almost step back from them and be able to make a more considered response.
I've put your link up there as well for that article,
Thank
Jan.
you. So the third part of the survey is around leading change. I guess there's not an organisation in the world that isn't undergoing some sort of change, even if that's kind of not necessarily the way they describe it internally. And many of you will know we've developed a model that looks at what are the elements within the brain, the areas within the brain that respond either to threat or reward in a social situation, and we call this model CORE. And we've used this model in the questionnaire to help people to understand, how their leadership style, particularly in a change situation, may be impacting others. And CORE stands for the degree of certainty, so we get a sense of reward when things are certain and we're able to predict what's going to happen. It stands for options, which is having some choice in what's happening. It stands for reputation, which is our sense of where we are in the social hierarchy and how much others value us. And it stands for equity, which is a sense of fairness. And the brain tends to notice something 3 to 5 times more threat than it does reward. So one of the powerful things leaders can be able to do is understand their own impact on their employees, what might be creating a sense of threat and what might be creating a sense of reward, and to mitigate that sense of threat and increase those senses of reward. And I can see someone's asking here, how is CORE different to David Rock's SCARF model? It's derived from exactly the same research as David used. So SCARF derives from looking at the research of a number of neuroscientists, and David Rock pulled it into this acronym of SCARF, and we've effectively done the same thing. There's a little bit of difference here in that in our own research we found that if you include the whole relational element, it tends to kind of almost double count, because this is taking place in a relational context anyway, so when people are in relation with themselves or others. David's model is copyright to him, and it didn't seem fair to breach his copyright, so we, in agreement with him, created our own model. And we also have someone asking, is there any possible link between emotional control and an increased level of need to control over others? How interesting. I've seen no research that suggests that. If anything, being in control of your emotions allows you to be in connection with others, so you don't get that amygdala hijack. And I think the end result of that would be you're more able to understand the motivations and what's happening with others rather than need to control them. It's a really interesting question, though. But as I say, I've seen no evidence that the two are linked in that kind of negative fashion. So the next area that we looked at is mindset. And for those of you who've done any kind of work around the neuroscience, you'll find that this is one of the areas that people are really latching onto in organizations. It's the work of Carol Dweck, who's actually not a neuroscience. She's a social psychologist at Stanford, and she's been studying the basis of success for well over 20 years. And what she has found is that people have one of two mindsets, and those mindsets tend to determine how they approach their work, how they approach learning, and their kind of worldview, if you like. She talks about it being their worldview. And she talks about two different mindsets. Now, I have to say I'm not kind of crazy about her labels, but we are where we are with those. So the first is what she calls a fixed mindset. And people who have a fixed mindset tend to believe that they were born with intellect or talents or abilities, and that there isn't very much that you can do about that. So you were either born talented or you weren't, and your role in life is to exploit those talents, to put yourself into situations where you can be seen as the best at what you're doing, and to take on jobs, to take on tasks, to take on activities where you can show those talents to their full potential. The problem with this mindset, particularly in modern businesses, is it's not very adaptable to change. So people with a fixed mindset tend to shy away from change. They tend to be to find it difficult to deal with setbacks, and particularly difficult to deal with when the requirements of a job start to shift. So we've done a lot of work with lawyers in this area, and what we find is, those of you who kind of understand anything about the legal profession, there's massive change going on in terms of what clients want from lawyers. So in the old days they wanted just a legal solution. These days they want a legal solution in the context of their business strategy. And many people in the profession are kind of have a fixed mindset, so they were recruited for mainly their intelligence, and are struggling with these extra demands that are being made by clients. The other mindset that Carol Dweck found is what she calls a growth mindset. And people with a growth mindset have a very different outlook on life. So no matter how intelligent they may be to start with, or how talented they may be, their outlook on life is that you can always get better. So people with a growth mindset tend always to be seeking healthy self-improvement, I guess is the way I would describe it. So they're the sorts of people who are asking what questions they got wrong on the test, a good one for your children. They're also the sorts of questions who tend to put themselves in situations that test their skills, that stretch their abilities. They're more likely to take a risk in taking a job that they're not really very sure if they're able to do it. And they are also the sorts of people who are continually trying to learn from others. So there's some evidence that they learn better from role models, for example, and seek role models out. And these people with a growth mindset are also much more likely to be able to cope with change. Now, if you did our survey and came out with a fixed mindset, you may be sitting there with your head in your hands going, oh dear, this is a bit of a shame. But worry not. Carol Dweck has found that actually we can change our mindset, that they tend to be stable until we understand about them. But once we understand about them, it's a fairly easy, it's relatively easy to shift that fixed mindset into a growth mindset. And one of the links that we've got for you is to an article that gives you some of the steps to be able to do that. And Jeremy, I can see you're answering people's questions on Hogan here. So thank you for doing that. one of the things we may well do with this Brain Savvy Leaders self-assessment is pull out some of these different sections, as I know there are lots of organizations that are using the whole idea of mindset and helping their leaders to understand what their current mindset is and shifting it. So if that's you and you're interested in that, please do let us know. I'd also be really interested in hearing what people thought about how they came out of the questionnaire, because it's one that we're often not that aware of. Okay, so type in if you have any questions on mindset. I'm going to go on to the last of the sections in the questionnaire, and that's about work habits. Now, some of you will know we did a webinar earlier in the year on work habits, and it's actually become the most looked at webinar on our website, even though it's been up some of the shortest amount of time. So it's clearly an area where people have a lot of interest. So what the neuroscience is basically beginning to tell us is our current work habits tend to make us brain fried, that is stressed, rather than brain savvy, that is using our brain to its maximum capacity. And a couple of areas where we're most likely to do that. One is that we tend to overestimate the capacity that the brain has. So a little bit of background here. Most of what we do goes on in the mammalian part of the brain, or it's often called the limbic system. And that's where our habits reside. And because that area is much more energy efficient than the cortical area, the prefrontal cortex, the brain likes to kind of push as much activity as possible into that mammalian brain. And the consequence of that is we tend to do things automatically. So we kind of automatically turn on the computer in the mornings, fire up our email, and start bashing through them. That's not necessarily the best use of our, fresh brain first thing in the morning. It tends to kind of tire the brain out, and within about an hour, our capacity for creativity, for thinking about problems, for planning, all of those prefrontal cortex activities becomes very depleted, and we need to go and refresh the brain in order to be able to kind of maximize our abilities in those areas again. And what happens is we get into the habit of just pushing through that, and we probably don't realize how, that impacts our productivity. So when you're, some of the things to look out for is when you find yourself sort of flicking backwards and forwards to your emails, or filing emails when you should be doing an important report, or feeling the need to kind of get up and wander or surf the internet, it's probably a signal that your brain capacity that your brain's tired, basically, and is trying to do something to shift the focus from one area to another to give it some respite. And it's much, much better for you to actually go with those signals that your brain is sending you, rather than try and fight it. The other really, really interesting stuff that I think is fascinating is when we give ourselves brain downtime. So when our brain is mind wandering, or we're going for a walk, or we've put a problem on the back burner, our brain activity is still going on. So our brain is still kind of working on those issues in our medial prefrontal cortex, almost why those things are on the back burner, out of conscious awareness. And there's some evidence that our brain is probably actually more active when we're mind wandering, when we're in what we tend to call kind of downtime, than it is when we're in focused attention. When we did this original webinar, people told us that most of their cultures that they work in, most of the organizations they work in, frown upon people taking work breaks. So going for a walk, taking a coffee break, taking a social break, having a sleep, sitting thinking, all of those sorts of things were frowned upon. And if people had worked out that there was some benefit for that, they had to do it surreptitiously, so they had to do it without others knowing. And yet, that's exactly the sort of activity that is most useful for problem solving, for making connections. And there is also evidence that people who do that make more ethical decisions as well. So I guess the message here is understand what your work habits are and how you may be, fighting the way your brain actually works, and adapt some of those work habits so that you work more consistently with how the brain works. And you end up with being more productive, ironically, by doing less. So I don't know what people think about that idea. I particularly like the kind of take some downtime. And once you start doing that, so once I read about this, I started practicing it myself. Once you start doing that, you do see that you're actually more productive. And if people are interested in this, I've just done an article for, or a blog rather, for people management, and I can send you, actually I don't have that link, Liz, but I can send you, we can pop that link on the list that Liz is going to send you at the end of the webinar. There's also quite an interesting book out called 2 Awesome Hours, which is a horrible title, but the book is very good, which looks at 5 different work habits and how you can maximize the way you use them to have 2 very good hours of focused work rather than deplete your brain. So those are the areas that the questionnaire covers. And our aim was to give people some insight into their own understanding of how they work. And we've also set up a number of resources to help people adopt some new habits once they know what their results are. So please feel free to kind of link through to those resources sections and look at your own habits. One of the things we'd really advise is to actually change one thing at a time. Because of the way our brain works, it's very hard for us to create new habits by, if we've got a number of them that we're trying to do. So pick one thing that you think will be most helpful to you, whether it's around your work habits, it's around your mindset, how you connect with others, how you manage your emotions, or how you lead people through change. Make that one change, and when you've mastered that, go on to something else. Now, there is a video, but unfortunately we can't seem to load it at the moment. So if you want to look at this summary video, it's on our website. And again, we'll send that link out. So we've got a few minutes for questions. So we've got Kate here saying the results very much mirrored my way of working. I recognized a lot of personal traits and also some of the people I work with. Thank you, Kate. That's good feedback. Good to know that it worked for you. Any other comments? Were there any areas that people found that they thought, oh gosh, that wasn't what I expected to see. That's not how I see myself. Got a few people typing their questions in here. I confess I did it myself, and even though I know what it was at, I struggled on the growth mindset, which was a surprise to me. And I think one of the things that can happen is, be conscious of what frame of mind you're in when you're doing the self-assessment, because that can impact you. So we've got Helena saying, I've recently done MBTI and expected some of the results. They were what I thought they would be, yeah. Afraid MBTI's getting some questions thrown around it at the moment, although it's a useful shorthand for most people. And we've got Gabriella saying, I was interested in seeing that I had a more fixed mindset than I thought. So something to work on. Yeah, great, Gabriella. You and me will be doing that together. And as I say, that article will give you some kind of steps. So, Jeremy, I don't really understand your question. How do your results in the individual areas relate to your overall course score? Sorry, Jeremy, I don't kind of quite understand what you're asking there. So if we don't have time to do this on this webinar, drop me a line and we can talk about it. And then Claire saying, it wasn't necessarily surprised with the results, however, I did find it really useful as a way to reflect on things I know I should do better. Thank you, Claire, for that feedback. One of the things we've found with it is if you look at the pattern of results within each of the individual sections, it's a really useful coaching tool because people can look at what their patterns are. So, for example, someone I've been working with was was quite good at connecting with other people, but gave very little attention to their own kind of connection with themselves, to actually, their metacognition and understanding their own kind of motivation. Okay, there's not necessarily a link, Jeremy. The different parts of the self-assessment stand alone, although we do know that people who are overall brain savvy are more effective leaders, and those who understand others better, so have better social control, typically understand the core elements and are able to manage their own emotions around those core elements better. But it's not necessarily linked to work habits, for example. Thank you, Jeremy. Kate, good to have you on the webinar. Thank you for joining us. So in the last couple of minutes, there's one thing we wanted to do that we're experimenting with. We've got David on the line, and David runs a company called Pay Compliment, and this enables us to get some feedback, and you can see our number up there, 2V148Y. So if you'd like to give us some feedback on this webinar in particular, but in the future we'll keep this open, please do so. We'd really like to use your feedback to tell others about these virtual webinar clubs. So if you don't want us to share, just kind of put don't share in brackets or something. But otherwise, we'd like to be able to share your feedback. So if you go on to that website, type in our ID number and leave us some feedback, that would be fantastic. I'd also recommend you take a look at what David's company are doing, because those of you who are taking out ratings and changing your performance management process might find his tool very, very useful. Okay, Liz, do you want to just wrap up?
I will do indeed. Thanks ever so much for that, Jan. Highly interesting. Got a bit caught up there. Lots of really good questions from everybody as well, and some really good comments and feedback, I think, as well. Really good. Thanks for that webinar. Fantastic. I'm Just before I leave, just some contact details for ourselves for Shorebird there. And if you are thinking of changing your recruitment process or becoming more effective with recruitment, then please get in touch. And there are the links there that you can listen and access all the previous and historic breakfast clubs that we've run before. And also, if you want to pass on to refer a friend. And then finally, if I can make the slides work, I did say at the beginning I'd let you know what events were coming up. The next one we've got is in September on the 23rd, and John's going to talk about the power of positivity. If you click on these images, you can access those events. And then the next one will be in October for Making Better Decisions. That's what we've got planned so far. So I think we're running up to the point of 9:15, which means that the webinar is almost officially over. So again, thank you very, very much, and have a really good summer. And I'm sure Jan and myself and everybody wishes you a really good hot summer as well. And hopefully that rain will disappear. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all of those who did the questionnaire. And if you haven't, it will stay open until next Friday. So that's Friday the 15th. Thanks again.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to end the webinar now.